Okay, well, I'm just an economics lecturer at the University of Adelaide. I've been in one South Australian uni or another for nearly 20 years now. Before that, I used to train bankers in London, including people working in the Bank of England. You asked me to talk to you about modern monetary theory, which is something that I use to understand the world. But one of the things I would have said at the beginning is I have no right to claim to speak on behalf of modern monetary theory. I'm not one of the people that devised this approach to thinking about the economy. I have been using it so long that I know personally every single one of them that did, because 15 years ago, there were so few MMT economists that you couldn't help but know everybody. Even 7 or 8 years ago, I thought, well, we've been right about so much for so long, including the global financial crisis, but in Australia, nobody's interested. I don't know why we're bothering having these conferences, because no one's listening. But that's changed. Quite a lot of the reason for that to change, although a lot of MMT was developed in Australia, is actually a consequence of the Bernie Sanders team, economics team, being mainly made up of MMT economists like James Galbraith and especially Stephanie Kelton, who has basically in the last year or two been the global face of modern monetary theory, and she's on the, every time you see a list of the most influential economists around the world, she's on that list now. And people like Stephanie and Bill Mitchell from Australia and one or two others fly around the world, but at least when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And these days, they don't just give talks to other MMT economists. They're welcoming, not that policymakers are acting on these things, but they give talks to parliamentarians in central banks, in treasuries. And I've done a talk in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra. Not that they listen to me, but they let us in the doors now. And we are confident that we're in the early to middle stages of a paradigm shift as far as macroeconomics is concerned, and that there's so much momentum now that almost regardless of, I mean, I obviously think MMT is useful, but almost regardless of whether it is or not, it's going to take over, because there's just too much. You get to a point where it becomes unstoppable. And I think we're at that point now. Stephanie's bringing out a book next month, which will be a global bestseller. And every newspaper in Australia has run articles about MMT, not all that well informed sometimes. And I'm although I'm just an economics lecturer, as I said, I'm not one of these people, but I've myself, the last couple of months, I've been so busy talking to people about MMT and groups like this, loads of radio interviews, more than I can remember. Awesome. Television and that's basically because we're still short of people to do the talks in Australia. It shouldn't be me that's doing these talks, it should be somebody else. But Bill Mitchell can't do everything.
No, well, it's great that you could join us. And although we only have a small group, we're all very passionate, and hopefully we can take some great notice of what you're about to present to us and distribute it widely. We've just had a couple of others. So we've got who have just joined us. Stephen Hale on the line, an economist, lecturer at the School of Economics at the Adelaide University. So if you can share your screen from there, Stephen.
I certainly can, yeah. I should be no problem at all.
Feel free to kick off.
The right thing. There we go. Let's see if this works. I think it's worked. Let me get rid of my face from my own
there we go.
Screen in front of me. I want to be looking at myself. Okay, and I'll go to start at the beginning then, I guess. I'll stick pretty more closely than I normally do to the script perhaps this evening, because you've given me a very difficult job in some ways, I'm going to try and introduce you to the work of some very talented and hardworking economists, which they've spent, in some cases, 30 years developing. So there are many, many academic papers and referee journals on MMT. There are lots of books. I've written one of the books, Economics for Sustainable Prosperity, that's up there on the right-hand side of the slide. And these people, the people that developed modern monetary theory, it's got long historical roots, but who put those historical roots together from the 1990s onwards were one Australian, William Mitchell, Bill Mitchell, at Newcastle University, and I guess three Americans, Randy Wray, Bill and Randy, along with Bill's colleague at Newcastle, Martin Watts, published last year the first MMT-oriented macroeconomics textbook. We're getting that arrogant now, you might say, that we've begun to publish economics texts where we don't put modern monetary theory in the title anymore. The other Americans were Stephanie Kelton, who I mentioned before, who was the senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders on both his presidential campaigns, and for a while was the chief economist on the Democrat side on the Senate Budget Committee in Washington, DC. And Warren Mosler, who's a fund manager and entrepreneur. Those were the four, really. Martin's important as well, and another important MMT economist is James Galbraith, son of the great J.K. Galbraith, who's sitting there next to Stephanie, some Bernie Sanders meeting from a while back. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to their work, to a very different frame for thinking about economics, or lens for understanding macroeconomics and economic policy, to the one which most of us are familiar with. And that's what modern monetary theory is, really. It's a new lens. Most of what I'm going to say is descriptive. My sympathies are towards the left, or the green left in politics, but for most of what I'm about to say, I'm going to try and stay neutral, because MMT intrinsically is neither left wing nor right wing. It's just a brand name for an approach to thinking about macroeconomics, and when I say fiscal space, about the appropriate role for the government budget to play in the economy, and the freedom of action the government has in terms of using its budget to try to deliver non-inflationary and equitable full employment, or any other set of macroeconomic objectives that the government might have. The point that these guys have been making since the 1990s is that the old approach to macroeconomics, well, there are many things about it which I fundamentally disagree with, and there have always been heterodox economists, non-orthodox economists, who have pointed out the deficiencies and the biases in neoclassical macroeconomics, which is basically the way of thinking about the economy, which has been dominant in both the Liberal Party and the Labour Party over the last 40 years. But the one thing that we particularly focus on, although I want to focus on this evening, is that the way in which that old mainstream represents the monetary system is, well, if you're the US, it's 50 years out of date. If you're Australia, in the fullest sense of the term, it's, well, it's at least 37 years out of date, because since we floated the Australian dollar in 1983, Australia has been what we describe as a full monetary sovereign, with a currency issuing monetary sovereign government. And the currency issuer in Australia is not the RBA. The RBA is the agent of Parliament, but it's the Australian government, subject to parliamentary authority, subject to getting its budgets through Parliament. You are a full monetary sovereign if, like Australia, you issue your own currency and you collect taxes in that currency. If, and this has been true for Australia since 1983, that currency is not fixed to any foreign currency or commodity that you could possibly run out of. So the Australian government, the RBA on behalf of the Australian government, is not committed to exchange Australian dollars for anything like gold or anything like US dollars at a fixed rate, which we could possibly run out of. And if you have no significant foreign currency denominated debt, and for years now, the Australian Commonwealth Government has had no significant foreign currency denominated debt. Australia is a full monetary sovereign economy. The same thing is true of the UK, where I come from, the USA, obviously, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and a variety of other countries. Modern monetary theory has a lot to say about countries which do not enjoy full monetary sovereignty, but that's not what I'm going to focus on this evening because we have limited time. So we're going to focus on Australia and countries with monetary systems similar to the Australian system. If you are a full monetary sovereign, as I'm going to explain, you can't run out of your own currency. It is literally impossible for there ever to be a financial crisis based on Australian Commonwealth Government debt, while the Australian Commonwealth Government only issues debt securities in Australian dollars. So you have no purely financial constraints. So Josh Frydenberg was in the Australian Financial Review today saying, oh, of course, everybody knows there's not a magic money tree. Well, I've got news for him, and it should be obvious to everybody now with the government budgeting to engage in emergency spending of $200 billion plus the moment there's a global pandemic comes around the corner. It's not a tree, it's a computer keyboard. But effectively, of course, there is a money tree. The Australian Commonwealth Government has literally no financial constraints on its activities. However, that is far from being a justification for limitless spending, because all economies, including the Australian economy, have real resource constraints. What do I mean by that? We've got a limited stock of labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and infrastructure and institutional capacity and natural resources. So we've got a limited productive capacity, of course we do. And if total spending on what's produced in Australia, spending by the private sector, and for that matter, the rest of the world, and the government, goes beyond that productive capacity, then you expect the private and public sectors competing for scarce resources to drive up costs and prices and to cause rising and potentially accelerating inflation. So it's inflation that is the barrier. It's always inflation that's the issue when we come to judge government fiscal programs and government policies. The government cannot run out of Australian dollars, however. So as far as whoever is in power is concerned, subject, as I said, to the authority of Parliament, there is no limit to their ability to spend Australian dollars. Of course, in the long run, not just Australia, but the whole planet has ecological limits, which we are well beyond at the moment that we need to address. So if we in total spend too much on the wrong kinds of things or on things that we've produced using the wrong techniques, then of course we can continue to fry our planet and destroy our ecosystem. That is the most important long-term constraint. In the short run, yes, we have the inflation constraint, but do we have to panic that the Australian government is going to be running a fiscal deficit of maybe 10% of GDP this year, maybe more than that? No. Is this creating a burden which is going to bear down on future generations or require austerity in the future in order for a debt to be repaid? The message is going to be no. The Australian Commonwealth Government has no purely financial constraints. What it's doing at the moment is not going to lead to significant inflationary pressures around the corner. It is not engaging in spending at the moment, which is going to impose any sort of burden on us next year or the year after or on future generations. And if politicians say that as an excuse for austerity, then it's just an excuse. They're making political decisions. They're not making decisions which have an economic imperative. Why do so many people misunderstand this? And for all I know, Josh Frydenberg might misunderstand it. And for all I know on the other side, Anthony Albanese misunderstands it. It's because they imagine, because of the narrative that people got used to down the years, they imagine our monetary system works like the diagram on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, it appears to be the case that the government has to tax or borrow. So tax, the TABS acronym means you tax and you borrow in order to raise Australian dollars if you're the federal government, and then you can spend those dollars. This is the way most people think our monetary system works. You've got the federal government down here. It's getting its dollars in from the private sector in taxes, or it's borrowing dollars from the private sector. But you notice it's bleeding the private sector dry. The private sector doesn't have many dollars in the first place. So the federal government, of course, is having to borrow money from the rest of the world as well. It's borrowing all those dollars from China too, which it's using to fund lots of entitlements, which it's paying out under normal circumstances. They make it seem to lazy people. And it's using its imagination to find all sorts of other ways, discretionary ways of wasting dollars, as well as, of course, as having the burden of paying interest on, and repaying the principal of dollars that it's borrowed in the past. This is the way most people think of our monetary system, and it's profoundly wrong. Our institutions and our accounting might make it appear that the system works the way it works on the left-hand side, but it doesn't work that way. The way it works is the way it's represented on the right-hand side. The government, as the currency issuer, spends new dollars into the system. They then tax some of those dollars back out of the system again, and they may choose, and in recent decades have chosen, to borrow the difference between what they're spending and what they're deleting from the system. I prefer to say that rather than raising taxes. Every dollar that the federal government spends, and this is true in a technical sense when we're thinking about the net financial assets of what I'll call the non-government sector in a moment, but it's also true when you look at every official measure of the money supply. This is literally true. Every dollar that the Commonwealth government spends is a new dollar. This includes interest payments that the federal government makes to those savers who hold treasury bonds which have been auctioned by the federal government in the past. The dollars that the federal government spends into the system, of course, create dollars which are then available for the private sector to hold as savings, but also that expenditure creates the economic and social infrastructure on which our economy and profitable businesses and employment sits. Now, if all the government did was spend and they didn't use taxes to delete some of those dollars from the system, then federal government spending would be hyperinflationary and the system would break down. So we can immediately see here what the purpose is at the federal level of having taxes. It's not to raise dollars for the government to spend. The government has not had to raise taxes before it's engaged in the spending it's doing at the moment in order to support people and the economy during the current pandemic. It's to delete some of the dollars that the government has spent into existence from the system so that the private sector, the ability of the private sector to spend is restricted in order to create room within our productive capacity for the federal government to spend on public goods and services without it being inflationary, without pushing total spending beyond the productive capacity of the economy. Why have we got into this habit, particularly since the early 1980s, of auctioning treasury bonds to more or less precisely match the difference between federal government spending and taxation over time? That's a complicated one, but if I go down that rabbit hole in any detail now, we're going to be here all evening. So I can write you an answer to that question later on, but the important point to bear in mind is that issuing treasury bonds is a choice. It's not something that the federal government is obliged to do. They do play a useful role in our financial system, including offering fund managers with a nice, safe, interest-bearing asset to hold when those fund managers are looking to provide us with an income in our retirement from superannuation. But the issuance of treasury bonds is a choice. The bond market is never in a position to dictate to the federal government. The federal government didn't need to issue those treasury bonds in the first place. And indeed, it's a little bit complicated the way they're doing this, but right now, the RBA over the last couple of months has been buying treasury bonds in the second-hand market faster than the federal government's been auctioning them in the private primary market. So while our government has been doing this deficit spending over the last few weeks, the number of treasury bonds, the volume, the value, I should say, of treasury bonds out there in the marketplace has actually been shrinking, not increasing. That makes it obvious that the issuance of treasury bonds is a choice that governments have made. It's not something that a monetary sovereign government ever has to do. So an acronym which is not misleading is the STAB acronym. If you are a monetary sovereign currency issuer, you spend new units of your currency into the system. You then tax some of those units of currency back out of the system. If you spend more than you tax, then you're running a fiscal deficit, a government budget deficit. You may choose to offer the people that are holding the dollars that you've created through that deficit spending the opportunity to hold treasury bonds rather than holding bank deposits and rather than the banks themselves holding reserves at the RBA. But all you're doing is you're offering those savers the opportunity to have a term deposit, a transferable term deposit rather than a transaction account, because that's all treasury bonds are really. They're transferable term deposits at the RBA, nothing more or less than that. So it's really important that when we think about our monetary system, we avoid thinking about the government as though it is a household that has to find dollars somewhere before it can spend, because our government is a monetary sovereign. It actually has to spend dollars into the system before they can be taxed back out of the system. It's the other way around. And when almost everybody talks about the role of the government in the economy and the role of fiscal policy, particularly the role of the government budget, they start off on the wrong foot because they put the cart before the horse. They are thinking about the government as though it needs to raise taxes in order to get dollars before it can spend them. And that's not the way it works. Instead, every dollar the federal government ever spends is a new dollar, like I was saying. All federal spending involves currency issuance. We don't like to use the term printing money. I often get asked by people who don't yet understand MMT, and I guess it's a very question. They say, are you advocating for the government printing money? And the answer we give to that question is, well, there's nothing being printed here, really. It's all electronic. But our government spends, even under normal circumstances, the federal government spends about $1.5 billion a day, and every single dollar is currency issuance. So absolutely every dollar the government ever spends in an electronic sense is printing money. They then tax some of that money back out of the system again, but all government spending involves printing money. In this sense, involves the creation of our currency, Australian dollars. Taxes delete dollars from the monetary system. As I said, bond issuance, if you choose to do it, converts dollars from transaction accounts at the, sorry, I used this slide with a bunch of Americans, at the Fed, at the RBA, it should say, to transferable term deposits. What is a government deficit then? It is no more or less than a contribution of dollars that the federal government is making to the rest of the economy. It's a deposit that the federal government is making somewhere in the banking system. What is a government surplus? A government surplus is just when they tax us more than they spend, basically. What's happening then? They're deleting dollars from the system. A government surplus is throwing dollars in the bin, you might say, or it's a vacuum cleaner for dollars. It's the government deleting more dollars from the system in this period of time than they're spending into the system in this period of time. And as we're going to see in a moment, that actually weakens private sector balance sheets and helps to push economies towards financial crises. It's the opposite of what people think. Government surpluses in economies like Australia are not a consequence of a responsible fiscal policy. It's the other way around. And when we talk about the government's debt, which people wrongly sometimes call the national debt, what is it? Is it something to be scared about? Could the government become insolvent at some point? Of course not. The government's the currency issuer. It can't run out of dollars. The Japanese government has 6 times as much debt relative to the size of its economy as Australia's government does at the moment. And Yet the Japanese government is in no worse a position when it comes to funding spending to support its economy during this pandemic than Australia is. All the government's debt is dollars that the federal government has spent into our monetary system and has not yet taxed back out of the system, no more nor less than that. This is not a new idea. As I said, some of the roots of modern monetary theory are long historical roots. And the role of taxes for a monetary sovereign, because immediately after the Second World War, the fixed exchange rate Bretton Woods system had not started up yet, so basically the US government was a monetary sovereign. The role of taxes in a monetary sovereign were explained clearly, just the way we explain them now in modern monetary theory, by somebody called Beardsley Rummel, who, and you can find this essay on the internet if you do a search for it, just with that title, Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete. He was the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve, and actually in those days, that was the most powerful job in the American central bank. It was a more powerful job than being the chairman of the whole system. And Beardsley Rummel explained, as I've explained, that if you're a currency issuer in the US, if you issue the US dollar, in Australia these days, if you issue the Australian dollar, you can't run out of your own currency. He's not the only chairman of the Fed to have explained that. Alan Greenspan explained it similarly a few years ago as well. So why do we have taxes in the first place? That's another question people sometimes ask you, and I've sort of answered that already, but we can go back a little bit historically and we can say, let's think about introducing a currency where no currency existed before. We've got plenty of examples of this from colonial history, the British Empire, for example, back in the 19th century, in various African countries, where previously there'd not been a monetary system in the modern sense. How
20 minutes.
How do you?
Do you want something, Dave?
Sorry, do you think you put yourself on mute for a minute? Sorry. How do you go about introducing a currency where people are not used to using a currency, and why would you go about doing that? Well, if you're an imperial power.
Explain.
I'm struggling to concentrate. If you're imperial power, I try to get people to work for you, and you don't want to enslave them. Then the way you do this is you impose a tax liability on them. So if I'm the British Empire going way back, and I've invaded and taken over Ghana, or the Gold Coast, as I might have called it, and I want people to come and work for me, but I don't want to enslave them in order to get them to work for me. I'll obviously be perfectly in a position to pay them in coins with Queen Victoria's head on, if it's the 19th century and she was the Queen at the time. But how do I get them to want to work for money with Queen Victoria's head on? Easy. I impose something like a hut tax. I tell them that I'm going to imprison you, or I am going to enslave you, unless you pay me a tax. You've got to pay me a tax in Queen Victoria's currency. Don't have any at the moment? Well, you'll have to come and work for me then, won't you? Or you'll have to supply a good or service to somebody else who is working for me, so that you can get the Queen's currency, so that you can pay your taxes. Now, the LSE anthropologist, David Graeber, has told this story very well in a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, that if you're really interested in the history of money and where it comes from and the nature of money, I very strongly recommend. So taxes played a role in the introduction of currencies in the first place. And by the way, how can we be sure that there'll always be a demand for Australian dollars in this age of cryptocurrencies? Well, as long as the Australian Commonwealth government has a legal system behind them, and as long as they collect taxes in Australian dollars, and as long as you've got to pay taxes, you're going to have to get some Australian dollars. There'll always be a demand for the currency. So that's one role for taxes. Bringing us into the modern world for a moment, another really important macroeconomic role is to, as I've mentioned before, to limit the ability of the private sector to spend in order to create room within the economy for the government to spend without there being too much spending, creating inflationary pressures. That does not mean that the level of taxation and the level of government spending have to be equal to each other, either in a particular year or on average over time. And in general, government spending is greater than taxation. In general, the private sector wants to increase the amount of dollars that it saves over time, and those dollars come from federal governments, not just in Australia, but elsewhere in the world, running deficits most of the time. But if the deficit is too big, yes, it can be inflationary. So if you don't want to cut back on public spending and you don't have any other mechanism for controlling inflationary pressures, then you can imagine circumstances when you have to increase the level of taxation in order to limit total spending to the productive capacity of the economy. And of course, there are other reasons for having taxes as well, which we're well familiar with, to discourage some activities like a carbon tax, to encourage others, subsidies, which is negative taxes after all, and to modify the distribution of income and wealth, as we used to do much more in the past when we had a more progressive tax system than we do now. The next thing to say, Scott Morrison, he was making a big fuss, wasn't he, with Josh Frydenberg last year about being on the brink of getting the Australian Commonwealth government's budget back in the black again after all these years. The trouble with the government being in the black is that somebody else has to be in the red under these circumstances, because as a matter of national accounting, the government's financial balance plus everybody else's financial balance all added up has to come to zero. Just to keep this simple, I mean, this is basically because for every net lender in our monetary system, there has to be a net borrower, and they cancel out. And if the government is running surpluses, that means the government is a net lender on the system over time. And for that to be possible, there have to be net borrowers somewhere else on the system. Now, we normally divide up the non-government part of our monetary system between our domestic private sector and the rest of the world, or the foreign sector. And once we do that, it's quite right that if you're like Singapore, or if you're like Norway, and if you run a big trade surplus over time, that means the rest of the world is net borrowing on your monetary system. Under those circumstances, your government and your private sector can both run surpluses at the same time. The government can pay down its debt and maybe even build up savings like in Norway, and the private sector can save as well and have strong balance sheets. But in a country without a big trade surplus, technically I would say without a big current account surplus, and Australia's current account went temporarily into small surplus last year. That will soon be reversed now. It had not been in surplus before that since 1974. If the government is going to run a surplus, then that means the private sector has to be in deficit. And in Australia, between the mid-1990s and the global financial crisis anyway, the main element within our private sector that was doing the deficit spending wasn't businesses, it wasn't the mining companies, it was households. And that's where we got all our household debt from. We went from having a relatively low level of household debt in Australia in the early 1990s to having the world's second highest level of household debt now relative to the size of our economy. And this is basically unsustainable. It's one reason why the RBA can't do anything very much to prop the economy up, because even if they cut interest rates to zero, as basically they've done, there is so much debt being carried by households in Australia that there are very few households that want to take on more debt and are in a position to take on more debt in order to do the spending, in order to support the economy. And in an absence of high levels of demand and the prospect of making profits in the future, then there isn't much demand for deficit spending by corporates, by businesses either. So there really is not very much that the RBA can do anymore in order to push the economy forward. It's all down to the government. And what the government has to avoid doing in the future is talking about austerity or talking about trying to go back into black or running a surplus, because by doing that, remember, they're just vacuuming up dollars from our financial system. And if the private sector is not prepared to go further into debt in order to support the economy, then that just, well, it either pushes the economy into recession, or where we're already in a terrible recession like we are at the moment, it would mean that in subsequent years, once we got past this pandemic, there would be a prolonged period of economic weakness and high unemployment and high underemployment. Here are the sectoral balances for Australia. I've represented them in two different ways, so you can choose whichever chart you want to look at. The one on the right-hand side, the stack bar chart, makes it clear that surpluses and deficits always cancel out in our system, like I was saying. The one on the left has the three sectoral balances separately. We've got the foreign balance there. This goes back to 1988. The foreign sector would have been in surplus going all the way back, as I said, to 1975. The foreign sector surplus is basically Australia's trade or current account deficit. The government balance is the red line. And you can see the Howard surpluses there, can't you? In the late 1990s and early 2000s. You can even see Paul Keating and Bob Hawke's surpluses there at the end of the 1990s as well. And you can see a relationship between the government's balance in Australia and the private sector balance. What allowed John Howard and Peter Costello to run those government budget surpluses, bearing in mind the rest of the world was in surplus on our monetary system too? It was deficit spending in the private sector. Historically in Australia, and this has nearly always been the case in other comparable economies around the world, the private sector has been in surplus. That's the healthy place for the private sector to be. That's when private sector balance sheets are getting stronger. That's when household debt's not increasing. That's when the private sector is adding to its savings over time. We want the blue line to be above the horizontal axis. When the blue line is below the horizontal axis, well, as I said, it means the private sector is going further into debt. There may be circumstances when that is appropriate, but when it's basically rising household debt and it's associated with a skyrocketing property market, it's not a healthy sign at all. It's what allowed Costello and Howard to run those surpluses. Of course, when the GFC came, the private sector became much more cautious, stopped borrowing, ran into surplus. At that time, of course, remember under Kevin Rudd, our government went into deficit. About half of that was the Rudd stimulus. The other half was just an automatic consequence of the economy slowing down, tax receipts falling and unemployment rising. But you can see that negative relationship between the government balance and the private sector balance. The thing is, the private sector is not a monetary sovereign. Rising private debt creates a fragile monetary system, which we now have in Australia. It is the monetary sovereign which should normally be doing the deficit spending, not the government. You can see the same thing over here. The blue means the private sector's in deficit. The red means the government was in surplus. Government surpluses are not a sign of an economy becoming more stable with a more sustainable set of balance sheets. It's the opposite, particularly in an economy which runs a trade deficit where the foreign sector is in surplus. Just to reinforce this very, very quickly, I added this slide. I don't want to spend more than a minute on this, but I've got data for the UK going back to the 18th century. The blue represents the private sector. Where is the private sector normally? It's above zero. The private sector should be, naturally, normally is in surplus. Where is the government most of the time? It's in deficit. The British government balanced its budget in the 19th century. That's because the empire was doing the deficit spending there. Or looking at the right-hand side, I've only got data going back to the millennium here, but for 39, what the IMF calls advanced economies. Every year since the millennium, where can you see the private sector collectively lying? It's in surplus. Where is the government every year? It's in deficit. This is the normal set of circumstances internationally. It's not anything to be scared of, deficit spending by governments. It's normal and natural, and generally speaking, it's a healthy thing to happen. Just before the GFC, advanced economies, private sectors nearly went into deficit, but even then, collectively, they didn't. A fiscal deficit is simply the dollar contribution that the federal government is making to the monetary system. The government's debt is just the total of all those past contributions. It's just the dollars they spent into the system and they haven't taxed back out of the system yet. The only concern is if they spend too much in and they don't tax enough out, Total spending goes beyond the productive capacity of the economy, and under those circumstances, yes, there's a risk of accelerating inflation. Not that fiscal policy is the only way to manage that inflation risk, but one of the ways of managing that risk might be to increase the tax stake or cut some areas of government spending. But we're a very long way away from that as far as Australia is concerned. We haven't always had the narrative that we've got used to over the last 40 years in Australia. Australia does have a history of deficit spending by governments maintaining full employment. So I just thought I'd show you the unemployment rate in Australia during the 1950s and 60s. It only once went very marginally above 2%. Robert Menzies almost lost a general election because unemployment went above 2%. It was seen as a scandalous thing in those days, and there was no underemployment to speak of at the time. Full employment continued in Australia till 1974. Between 74 and 78, the unemployment rate went up to about 6% or so. But I've included on the right the underutilisation rate, including people who are underemployed, people who have some paid employment, but not as much as they would like, because that's a fairer statistic to compare with unemployment in the 1950s and 60s than the current unemployment statistic, which is it's become very difficult to interpret its significance anymore. Underutilisation is more important because we have so much casual employment in the gig economy. And obviously this is not updated here, but you can see that by the end of the 1970s, we had significant underutilisation in the Australian economy, and you can see that there's been a long run trend for it to increase. It jumped upwards during the recession that Paul Keating told us we had to have in the early 1990s. It's then come back down again, of course, but there is an upward trend. The underutilisation rate is going to jump above 20% in Australia now, and yes, it will recover somewhat once we get past this pandemic, but probably that upward trend will continue unless we rethink the way we do our macroeconomics, because really we can't restore the social and economic conditions of the 1950s and 60s, and we wouldn't want to, but we really do very much need to move back to a situation where there's no involuntary unemployment or underemployment in Australia, I believe, because that's the key to getting inequality down again. When was inequality? The graph on the left-hand side is a measure of inequality in Australia. When was it at its lowest level? In the mid-70s. What do we know about the mid-70s? That was the last time there was full employment in Australia. The top line is the degree of inequality in Australia before the tax and transfer system, basically. And you can see there was a big increase in inequality between the mid-70s and about the year 2000, and it flattened out. I think the Labour Party should be a little bit ashamed that it was actually in power for most of that time. The big increase in inequality in Australia came to a considerable extent under Labour governments. On the bottom, we've got the degree of inequality in Australia after you take the tax and transfer system into account, and we can see that since the year 2000, inequality has increased a little bit more in Australia, not pre-tax and benefits, but because of changes in our tax and welfare system since then. In the mid-1970s, Australia had a Scandinavian level of inequality. We don't now. We have more inequality of income and wealth in Australia now, for example, than the US did in the 1970s, not as much as they do now, but a level of inequality that would have been seen back in the early 70s as being just completely socially unacceptable. How did Robert Menzies deliver full employment? I just thought I'd quickly, sorry it's a bit untidy, but I'd quickly reproduce some Commonwealth Government budget data from the distant past. Remember the Keating surplus? You can just about see that on here. But the Australian government, all the way back to the beginning of the 1950s, basically ran deficits. How was it possible to do this? Well, we had a different monetary system then, and we had fixed exchange rates. But even then, the Commonwealth government was in a very different position to you and me. Well, obviously, we can't net spend. We can't run deficits year after year after year. But that's a normal thing for governments to do. And when governments talk about returning to surplus, returning Australia back to the situation in the Howard years, the government's hardly ever been in surplus. Australian governments have run deficits 80% of the time since Federation, and they'll run deficits more than 80% of the time in the future, and they should, because government deficit spending provides the dollars that the private sector can spend and supports our economy, as I was saying before. Given that we would like to restore full employment, and given that there are reasons to think that the old Keynesian approach of the 50s and 60s wouldn't work now because of structural unemployment, because if you just go with a not well targeted fiscal stimulus, well, first of all, you're going to be the people that benefit from that, the people at the front of the queue for jobs in the first place, the people who need the help least. You're going to run up against bottlenecks and skill shortages and capacity constraints. And of course, you're also going to do just a general fiscal stimulus does damage to our ecosystem as well. So we need a different mechanism if we want to move to equitable full employment, and if we're going to see that as a way of bringing inequality down. I challenged Andrew Leigh in public last year to commit the Labour Party before the federal election to a target for reducing inequality. And he told me that he didn't think he could get the shadow cabinet to go along with it. Well, I think there should be a target for reducing inequality. And I think a federal job guarantee, because it empowers people in insecure, low-paid jobs, is an important part of that. There isn't time now to go into the federal job guarantee in a lot of detail, but basically the idea behind it is if you lose your job, or if you are not fully employed, and if you want to do so, you should be able to walk into your local job guarantee office, and there should be a range of work opportunities which are available to you. Public sector work opportunities. We're not talking about the private sector being involved here, which contribute towards environmental or social well-being in your local community. So that if you're in a terrible job, if you're in a crappy job, you've always got the option of going and working in the job guarantee. The job guarantee, if it's well designed, should act as an automatic fiscal stabilizer too. Given that the government should normally deficit spend, it's not appropriate for the government to have any specific target for what its fiscal position should be. How do we, at the margin, set the appropriate level of the fiscal deficit, or perhaps even occasionally a surplus? I can't see that being the case in the foreseeable future in Australia. Well, the size of the fiscal deficit is set by the number of people who choose to participate in the job guarantee. And if there's an economic downturn, then people will naturally move from employment, if they lose their jobs, to, they'll at least have the option. It's not an obligation, it's not work for the dole, it's not a condition for you to receive New Star or a job seeker payment or whatever you want to call it. It's an alternative which is available to you. If you want to go and work on an environmental project, or if you want to work in a community garden, or if you want to help elderly people remain independent at home, we're not talking about nursing here, or if you want to train in local areas of skill shortages, then you should be able to turn up at the job guarantee office and participate in the job guarantee. You'll be working at minimum wage, which means you'll be making something like $40,000 a year if you're working full-time in the job guarantee. If that's what you choose to do, you'll have normal working conditions, superannuation, vacation, etc. As the economy recovers, as the private sector grows, as job opportunities develop as the economy goes into an upswing again, then the spending on the job guarantee will automatically fall when it's appropriate to do so. So the thing about the job guarantee is it should involve spending the right amount of money in the right places in the economy. People won't have to move to find employment. They'll be able to work close to where they live. The spending will be to the people that need the help. The people that spend a lot of time in the job guarantee will be the people who are not at the front of the queue for jobs when the economy's recovering. You're not going to come up against the structural unemployment issue because there'll be a range of activities available to people which are designed to fit people as they are. There will be training opportunities, but people won't have to take those training opportunities up. If people just want to work, well, in areas of the country where it's appropriate, if they want to be planting trees, then fine, they can do that. They could also be working in a not-for-profit as part of the job guarantee. They could be working in roles which are currently usually done exclusively by volunteers in local authorities as well. About 12 years ago, Bill Mitchell and the guys at Newcastle University did a survey of local authorities across Australia. There's no shortage of ideas. There's no shortage of things for people to do. We are not going to run out of useful jobs that people can do to support their community and the environment. And that's not the issue. The issue is funding it. So the important thing about a job guarantee is that it should be owned and managed locally, but it needs to be funded federally by the currency issuer. Bill Mitchell's been advocating for this for years. Actually, Hyman Minsky came up with a very similar idea, which he called an employer of last resort scheme back in the 1960s. The important thing is it would be an opportunity, not an obligation, to those who need it, when they need it, where they need it. And of course, we've had job guarantee-like programs that have run in the past. There was the huge Roosevelt New Deal programs in the 1930s, and I just put up a little picture here about the Federal Art Project, which was part of the Works Progress Administration in the New Deal. So yes, we can have people working on art or drama or music or writing. Bill, of course, Bill Mitchell is a musician and is very keen about providing support to musicians within a federal job guarantee. The largest job guarantee-like scheme in the world at the moment is the Rural Job Guarantee in India, which provides a limited amount of employment to about 15 million people a year. It would be in Australia, under normal circumstances, we might have 500,000 people working on a job guarantee. They've got 50 million people working on a scheme in India. If they can organise that, don't tell me we couldn't organise a federal job guarantee in Australia. Of course we could. There is a small project in South Africa called the Expanded Public Works Programme, which has some job guarantee-like characteristics. The trouble is it's not a guarantee because it's very underfunded, so there's a limited number of people that are able to participate in it. In the early 2000s, and people like Randall Wray and Bill were involved in designing this, there was a very successful job guarantee in Argentina between 2002 and 2005 that employed about 2 million people, and that played a major role in Argentina's economic recovery from the collapse of 2002. And it was a tragedy that it was scrapped once the economy had recovered. We believe that the federal job guarantee should be something permanent, like Medicare or like the National Health Service in the UK, and that if you do it right, it will be too popular for a coalition government to eliminate if it's been introduced by, let's say, a Labour government. Anyway, we want a Green New Deal too, of course, and the important thing here, we know what this ought to involve. Perhaps I don't need to read through all these things. The important thing is that any transition away from fossil fuels, and if we're going to have, if you want to call it a just transition or a green transition, that doesn't mean going into mining communities and telling everyone they have to work at minimum wage on a job guarantee. It means the use of industrial policy as we used to have it in the past. It means developing new sources of high wage skilled employment and training opportunities so people can participate in those new green jobs as we gradually over time transition away from things like thermal coal, because we can't afford people to be going down coal mines anymore. We've got more important things for them to do. Of course, a federal job guarantee will play a role, but it should only play a very limited role. It's not a major part of a Green New Deal in itself. As always, the constraint is inflation risk. But when we're talking about a Green New Deal,